Hello, this is Duncan at O'Reilly's, having a lovely weekend up here, and I've just made a little video to celebrate the visit. It's a fabulous place. It's got quite a lot of birds and activities in it, so I wanted to share that with you. That goes for about 8 minutes. Now after that, there's a complete documentary of the Stinson air crash and how Bernard O'Reilly found them. It's a fascinating documentary. It celebrates quite uniquely Australian innovation, intelligence and courage and mateship. I was very moved by it. If you've got the time, it's 45 minutes, it's well worth watching, which is, I think, one of the lesser known stories of Australian mateship and courage and innovation and intelligence. So recommend that to you, but if you haven't got that much time, please watch the 8 minutes. Okay, happy Christmas. Bye bye for now.
The history of the O'Reilly family is that they moved from New South Wales largely because of the inducement from the Queensland government, but also because the bushfires where they were living in the Blue Mountains had become quite terrifying. So they decided to move, and 8 of them took up 100 acres each, and they got 800 of a family, 800 acres right in the middle of what's now the National Park. 4 years later, the government changed their mind and made it into a national park and wanted to buy the land back. But of course, the O'Reillys by that stage had spent 3 years clearing the land, and they owned it, and they had the legal option not to sell it to the government, so they did not. But then the government refused their part of the deal, which was to put a road through and to establish a community. So they were left, the O'Reillys were left totally isolated and had to use pack horses to cart everything up and down to their property for quite a number of years. So it's definitely an amazing story. But the following slides tell a bit of that. So the guest houses became the thing to do, and they built one on each of their 8 properties, and they became quite successful in doing that, and slowly moved out of the cattle industry and the milking industry, and had a lot of interest from people because of the unique setting in having a guest house right in the middle of a national park. It became very popular for people all over Brisbane, then Australia, and then internationally. And this move to form a national park was prompted by a guy called Collins, who got the idea from Yellowstone National Park in America, and he could be called the father of national parks in Australia. Really, he was quite a remarkable person. And this plaque celebrates his achievements. He was an MLC, must have been a politician. He convinced Brisbane that national parks were needed, and this national park was the 5th in the country. A very important one.
Oh. Hi. Hi. Yeah, I'm preoccupied, so I'm sorry, Crimson, but...
Spicy fruit, really.
Yeah, one of my favourites.
Parrots. There we go. Hold on to your sultanas. We're going to try to ignore the parrots because they get fed from 10 to 3 every day in the bird feeding area. What we want to see, the males are the yellow and black ones. The females and the juvenile males are difficult to see the difference in color. These guys here, just be careful guys, their nails are really sharp, they look cute, but they're little monsters. Bluish, dark blue. We do have our region bowerbird, and we do have the cat bird. It's the one that sounds like a baby or a cat. That's the three bowerbirds that we bird. And here at O'Reilly's, we've got two couples, and they've been coming to visiting us for 30 years now. A little bit over 30 years. As soon as they've built this boardwalk, the little whipbirds and the birds got a little bit used to us, and this is the closest you can get to a whipbird in Australia.
Female.
Now, this is the female.
Wow.
Keep an eye out. The lyrebird is still calling. So if you know what a lyrebird looks like, it's a bit like a pheasant brown looking chicken, but a slender chicken. There's not much meat on them. But and the king parrots, there's been a study that we have about 7 to 8. There's a song from Jimmy Barnes, I believe.
So this is the treetop walk, suspended right up in the air. Pretty cool.
If you look at the middle of that landscape in front of us, you can see patch of rainforest with red canopy and but it's surrounded.
Here is the route of the Stinson aircraft flying at night. Flew up this valley, right up here, right through here, and then it crashed right up there. You can see those mountains coming. Flying at night in bad weather with no instrument control, 1937. An accident waiting to happen.
No.
And we went to the other.
Okay, here is the...
On the set.
Fortunately for the pilots, a new breed of plane was soon to appear in Australian skies, a fast, sleek monoplane which boasted unheard of levels in passenger comfort. These planes were soon flying between capital cities in a matter of a few hours. Here is the news. Extensive land, sea and air searches have failed to locate the Stinson airliner VHUHH overdue on a flight from Brisbane to Sydney. Earlier reports of cooeys being heard in the Hawkesbury Valley had convinced searchers that the plane was forced down very close to its planned destination. It is understood that reliable sources have placed the crash near Pretty Beach, close to Gosford, but so far there's been no sighting of any wreckage. When last seen, the plane was flying at its normal height of 2,000 or 3,000 feet in bumpy conditions with bad visibility. The fate of the missing airliner and the 7 men aboard was to become mysteriously linked with Bernard O'Reilly, living in one of the most remote places in Australia. Meanwhile, wives and relatives of those on the plane are waiting anxiously for some reliable or positive news. You are about to witness one of the most remarkable series of events in the annals of aviation, told by the people who figured in this amazing drama. It is a story of courage and disaster, of belief in intuition, and the triumph of the human spirit in adversity. It is the miracle of the mountains. The year is 1937, and air transportation is well out of its infancy. There have been regular flights between capital cities for years, and Airlines of Australia has just taken delivery of the Stinson Trimotor, a passenger airliner manufactured in the United States of America. It will cruise at 170 miles an hour and has more than enough power to overfly the highest ranges in the country. Cost £13,000. In Australia, there were 2 routes available to aircraft flying from Brisbane to Sydney. One took them out to sea and down the coast. The other traversed a mountain range on the border of Queensland and New South Wales. This is one of the world's great wildernesses, the rugged McPherson Range, over 500 square miles of virgin rainforest. Lamington National Park was established as a national park in 1915. It is home to a treasure house of flora and fauna. Parts of these jungle-clad mountains have never been touched by mankind. Today, their descendants are still here, operating a highly successful international standard guest house for visitors to the park. Named by their forefathers, it is known as Green Mountains. The O'Reillys still carry on the family tradition of personal involvement with guests. Every year, many thousands of visitors from all over the world come to see the wonders and beauty of the Lamington National Park. Bernard O'Reilly's daughter, Relma, explains how the O'Reillys came to Green Mountains.
The O'Reillys originally came from down the Blue Mountains, Peninsula Valley. They're a very big family and they outgrew their small selection. So they decided to move up here. The bigger boys are the 5 oldest ones. And this was thrown open to selection up here on the mountain. They started in to clear the place of axes. That's all they had, was supply timber to be all full of axes.
The older ones, when they came here, it would have been tough. And I've often spoken to my father about this. I think there's two sides to the clearing of the land and the starting of the life up here. And things were tough, there was no doubt about that. And some of them were somewhat disillusioned with the fact that they were going to be isolated for 20 years or more. But others, the ones that stayed on, were very happy with the situation.
They'd only been here 3 years when this was gazetted as a national park. That meant there weren't going to be any more settlers. They were allowed to stay here.
People often ask why they came to such an isolated place. And I think maybe it's something to do with the fact that you're Irish. It doesn't matter. It's important to own a bit of land. It doesn't matter where it is. I didn't, I suppose, suspect that it would be as isolated. And the fact that the national park was formed around them meant that they were going to be isolated for a long while. But this didn't seem to worry them.
There was some talk of resuming it, but it never was done. But of course we didn't get a road then, so the next 30 years we packed everything on pack horses. Eventually people started coming up and staying with the family just to see the beauty of the national park here. And as the people came to see the park, they'd stay with the family or pitch a tent. And so the family decided the sensible thing to do was build a guest house. Well, the guest house got started. First of all, we had to get an engine up here and all our own timber. We cut the timber and built the house, and they were away.
Times have changed, and today O'Reilly's Guest House is just 2 hours by car from Brisbane and an hour and a half from Surfers Paradise on Queensland's Gold Coast. But it wasn't always that way. In the 1920s, the trip to O'Reilly's Green Mountains took 2 days. 5 hours by train to Beaudesert from Brisbane. Another 4 hours by horse-drawn coach to the Kerry Hotel and an overnight stay. Then 6 hours the next day up the perilous track by horse to the guest house. Yet holidaymakers had a different sense of time in those days, and O'Reilly's was unique. The majestic rainforest walks, the campfires and sing-alongs proved a magnet to nature lovers and holidaymakers alike. As the O'Reillys were enjoying the solitude of their magnificent mountain paradise, the outside world was rapidly changing. Australia was emerging from a rural farming population to one clustered in large cities along the coast. The machine age had arrived. It was the era of the telephone and big business. As Australian cities developed, increased commercial activity between the states was creating a demand from business people to travel faster between the capital cities. Just as the Harbour Bridge linked previously separated communities, so too the arrival of commuter aircraft would soon revolutionise interstate travel between the capital cities and the major town. The introduction by Airlines of Australia of the new Stinson airliner was an immediate success. They flew daily intercity flights in all weather. On February the 19th, 1937, Captain Rex Boyden boarded the Stinson airliner VH-UHH at Archerfield Aerodrome with 5 passengers travelling to Sydney. A gallant soldier, gravely wounded at Gallipoli, Captain Rex Boyden learned to fly during the First World War.
He applied and was accepted in the RAF. They taught him to fly and he flew over the North Sea and also over France before the end of the war. After the war, he took up flying again and tried to break the altitude record in those days and did some barnstorming in the Smithy Crowd and that. He went and flew for carpenters in New Guinea for several years, flying gold from Wau to Lae, and then joined Airlines of Australia.
Passenger Roland Graham was a prominent Sydney businessman convinced there was a big future for air travel.
My father, Roland Graham, always showed a keen interest in aviation and commercial-wise, and he had necessity to travel quite frequently. His main topic, so to speak, in those days was the flying, and he advocated that people should fly. It was good for business, He also predicted that the future of the commercial flying in Australia would grow to what it is today. He predicted that the time would come when he would be able to catch a plane in the morning and then either go to Brisbane or Melbourne and be back that same evening. And this is what he was hoping and looking for business reasons.
Passenger William Fountain was a leading architect from New York. He had brought his wife and 2 children to Australia whilst he designed a new movie theatre for MGM, the Metro, in Brisbane. Fountain was flying to Sydney to attend a conference. The co-pilot, Beverly Shepherd, had just returned from another flight and was travelling back to Sydney. One of the new breed of airline captains, Shepherd was a jovial, happy-go-lucky and popular person. Passenger Joseph Binstead was a Sydney wool broker. In those days, passenger lists were published in the papers, and so to avoid worrying his wife, who hated him flying, Binstead booked his ticket under the name Barnett. Passenger Jim Westray, a young man from England, was travelling for a major insurance company. He had packed a great deal of adventure into his young life.
James Westray was our uncle and also my godfather, and he was out of Australia on a visit, having only very recently got married.
He was a very good cricketer and sportsman, and did mountaineering in Scotland.
He obviously was a very courageous and brave man.
Passenger John Proud. Just out of university, Proud was returning to Sydney after having visited mining interests in New Guinea and Queensland.
I think we took off about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The day was cloudy overhead, a ceiling of about 2,000 feet. And we light southeasterly wind, no cause for concern anyway. The day took off quite normal. We flew, I settled out about to read, quite relaxed, normal flight, quite worried. Well, the planes were very small. I mean, the Stinson carried to C-10. No service on board.
Pilot Rex Boyden has flown the route over 500 times. He has now assessed the weather conditions and decided to fly the inland route. The Stinson is not fitted with a radio, and only a handful of people will know of Boyden's decision. One of the grand old men of Australian aviation, Tom Young, a former Stinson captain, recalls one of the main concerns for pilots in those days, the weather.
We used to fly them in all weathers, and we used to get some pretty bad weather. The Lamington to Plateau and down around Richmond Gap, the weather was the only thing that ever worried us.
The McPherson Ranges often formed their own bizarre weather patterns. Cyclonic storms would sweep across the ranges, striking the face of the mountains with a wave-like effect. Violent downdrafts would smash trees and anything else in their path. No one knew these storms better than the O'Reillys. From the ground on that fateful day, Bernard O'Reilly saw the telltale signs of just a storm brewing. The O'Reillys were a very close-knit family. Bernard O'Reilly is remembered by his daughter, Rilla.
So very, very fond of my daddy. I always called him Daddy. He'd grown up with the bush, and this country was his country. He was completely at home in it. He didn't have to wonder where he was. He knew where it was. It was part of his life. It wasn't for something that he learned. It was something he lived all his life.
Bernard grew up in the remote rainforest areas of the McPherson Ranges. He had a deep love of literature and classical music. He was especially fascinated by the many species of bird life which lived in the vicinity of his home. He studied their habits closely. Because of his long-term relationship in this wild yet beautiful area, his inbuilt intuition and his sense of adventure, Bernard was to be drawn into an epic journey which would prove to be the greatest challenge of his life. The Stinson battled up into the clouds, flying for a gap in the range that Boyden knew well. On the top of the range, violent gusts were tearing down trees and crushing foliage.
We flew into clouds maybe quarter of an hour after takeoff. Probably about by distance. We entered some minor turbulence when we entered clouds, but that was fairly normal. One didn't notice that. But as we flew on, that turbulence increased until it became quite marked.
At this stage, the airliner was flying south down the Kerry Valley, flanked on both sides by rugged mountains, with sheer drops plunging to the valley floor thousands of feet below. Ahead were the magnificent McPherson Ranges, and then a short hop to Lismore, where waiting passengers would be picked up, weather permitting. Victor O'Reilly explains the flight path of the Stinson.
This is Pat's Bluff over here. This was named after Pat O'Reilly, who was one of the early selectors. And the cleared area in the valley there is where the Stinson flew up the valley, and the red roofed house there is Mrs. Steinhardt's house.
The plane was so close to the house that the noise of the engines, I knew it was very low.
The other plane came out of cloud, and it was some sort of forest below, probably 400 or 500 feet. But we were rapidly losing height. Apparently the pilot at that stage was in rapid, extensive down current. He just could not maintain elevation. I got up and found that one of my legs had gone. Saw the window, got it out somehow, out on the wings, and stood down from the wing, just about to move off the wing. Then another head came out, windstripped, and following him another was westerly. That was the last. We got on the ground. We had to get very clear very quickly. The plane was on fire, and with its loaded fuel and highly inflammable fabric cover, it was ablaze in a very short time.
Amongst the wreckage, my father's watch, pocket watch, presented to him in 1911. But the watch had been partly melted, the gold, but the clock, the hands had stopped at 1:35 or 1:36, and it told a grim story.
The stunned survivors set about assessing the grim situation. John Proud's leg had a compound fracture. Sir John Proud recalls events directly after the crash.
Mr. Westray was badly burnt, I think on the back of his hand. He was also shocked, but he was very urgent to get going to bring help. So I gave him my cigarette case with a few cigarettes, so he went off in a very short time.
Westray, with his mountaineering experience, was keen to find help, as he had seen a farmhouse in the valley shortly before the plane crashed. For the two men left at the wreck, this was the beginning of a terrible ordeal. Meanwhile, others in Sydney were waiting for the aircraft, which was now overdue.
The day of the accident was a Friday, and my mother, as she would normally do, went to Mascot to meet my father. And I recall arriving home at around about 7:30. And she did look down in the mouth, and she didn't look too happy, and I said, "What is wrong?" And she said, "Well, they say your father, the plane has been delayed." First up, it was just announced that it was a delay. And consequently, it wasn't until very much later that we heard of the seriousness that the plane was actually missing.
A thermos flask had survived the crash, and this item of the plane's equipment would provide the key to Proud and Binstead's survival. The wreckage of the airliner actually lay hidden under this canopy of trees. Proud confidently believed that a search would be started the next day. It was, but it was taking place in the wrong area, over 500 miles to the south. The missing plane was front-page news, and reports of sightings flowed in. In all, 64 reports established that the plane had got to within 15 minutes of its destination, Sydney. All were inaccurate. People swore they'd seen the plane fly overhead, even that they'd heard cries for help. A police officer swore on oath he'd seen the plane flying out to sea near Newcastle. More than 25 aircraft and ground parties concentrated the search in the southeast sector of the flight path. Because of the number of reports later proven to be incorrect, the search planes were restricting their efforts to the area surrounding Sydney, when in fact the wreck was lying here in the rugged McPherson Ranges, 500 miles north.
As time was running out, I think you tend to adapt yourself to the inevitable non-rescue situation. So, about the third day we were there, a plane appeared overhead. That's since flown by one Frank Buchanan. He was looking through along the reach, sometimes circled overhead for apparently could not see where we were. But it gave us some hope that people knew we were up there somewhere and were looking for us. From that we then used to call out every half hour or so, hoping to contact some searcher.
Green Mountains had also been isolated by the storm, so it was a few days before Bernard O'Reilly read the newspaper reports. Something puzzled him. His brother Herb, who lived near Kerry in the valley below, had sighted the plane flying towards the mountains, yet passengers waiting ahead at Lismore heard nothing. In spite of the massive evidence suggesting that the plane had crashed near Sydney, Bernard was not convinced. The seed of an idea formed in Bernard's mind. Binstead had found a creek 400 metres from the wreck. Daily he struggled down the steep mountainside with a thermos to gather life-sustaining water for himself and Proud. Proud showed great fortitude despite the terrible pain in his leg. Proud's stoic and philosophical attitude to the grim situation helped sustain both men. Day 7 became day 8, 8 became 9, and still no help.
I became quite sure that the plane must have hit these mountains. My own husband wouldn't have it because he believed in the reports in the south. Everyone thought I was quite stupid and quite mad. They know what he'd have, but it did go this way.
From the Australian Broadcasting Commission. After 8 days of searching, all hope has been abandoned for the missing Stinson airliner VHUHH, which is now thought to have crashed at sea with its 2 crew and 5 passengers. An Airlines of Australia spokesman said that there was little possibility...
Bernard is not convinced that the Stinson has escaped the McPherson Ranges. His strong conviction is based on the cyclonic weather conditions of 10 days previous and the lack of reports over the ranges in the Lismore district. Bernard O'Reilly makes up his mind. He will try to solve the mystery of the missing Stinson. On the map, he drew a straight line from where the plane was last seen to Lismore, where it was due. The line passed over 4 mountain ranges, and Bernard reasoned that if the plane was in the mountains, it would be found on the northern slopes on the highest of these peaks. Bernard packed some meagre supplies, bread and potatoes, a few onions, and some tea. He then set out with his horse, aptly named the Great Unknown. As he became weaker, Binstead's journey down the steep mountainside to the creek became increasingly arduous. These painful journeys through rugged rainforest were draining much of Binstead's energy. The 2 men had now not eaten for 8 days, but the hunger pangs had gone after 2, and it was the precious water they craved. By now, Binstead's trips for water were taking most of the day to complete. The men's position was becoming increasingly precarious. The bones of Proud's leg were exposed, and the wound was fly-blown. Bernard rode his horse 4 miles to where the riding track finished at Mount Bethongabel. Even though Bernard understood this country, his rate of progress was reduced to 1 mile an hour by the vicious, thorn-covered lawyer vines and rugged gorges. Proud had told Binstead to leave and save himself, but Binstead knew that without water, Proud would soon die, and so Binstead decided to stay with the injured man to the end. Proud and Binstead were now on their last reserves of energy. They had been at the wreck site for 9 long days. Bernard spent the first night huddled beside a tree. At this stage, he had travelled 8 miles from home. In this radio recording from 1937, Bernard O'Reilly himself recalls the events that followed.
At 8 o'clock next morning, I climbed a very high ridge, about 4,000 feet, and in the far distance, on a very green range, I saw a yellowish patch, which I considered was some tree that had been killed by, its leaves had been killed by fire. Knowing the only possibility of fire was the, well, petrol or something like that, I decided to push forward to this point.
The burnt tree that Bernard glimpsed was a dot 6 miles in the distance, and he now pushed forward with a sense of excitement and urgency.
At 1:30, after very hard going, I crossed another ridge, and I thought I heard a very faint cooing. I pushed forward across the gorge. It took me somewhere about 3 hours in a general direction, and to learn that I cooed very loudly. I was answered by a cooey within 200 yards of it. I found where a top had been cut off a tree, and immediately afterwards I saw the mass of the wrecked plane lying in front of me. However, I got down to them. They were apparently in fairly bad way. I mean, you can imagine for yourself, people without food, without any hope for over 10 days, without the sight of another human being.
Was struggling for help days ago.
One of them crippled and couldn't walk. The other done some shock and suffering from starvation. However, these chaps still have their tech up. I made them some tea and left them what food I had, which was very poor, I admit. The heroism of these two men. When I struck them first, Mr. Crowley had been writing his last message on a piece of metal from the plane, scratching it with a penknife. Within 5 minutes, they were asking me about the test match, how much many Bradman had. And I started back to civilization, or I thought where civilization lay. I wasn't quite sure of myself. I think I'd been lost for a few hours too.
In his book Green Mountains, Bernard O'Reilly describes his discovery of James Westray. Ah, there was my man, just ahead, sitting with his back against a big boulder. "Hello," I shouted. He didn't move, must have been asleep. I came round the front of the rock. There was no need for a second look. The Englishman was dead. He was gazing it seemed, down the gorge to where lay safety and civilization. His face had injuries. There was a burnt-out cigarette stump between his fingers, and on a rock beside him, a silver cigarette case. He'd been bathing a smashed ankle in the torrent beside him. Time will never remove that picture of him sitting with his back to the rock. Below the wreck site, Jim Westray's lonely grave is overlooked by a mountain named in honour of his heroic attempt to get help. Bernard now knew that he must try to reach help before dark, and although exhausted, threw caution to the wind and started a frantic run down the creek. He knew that without help, the men at the plane would suffer the same fate as Westray. This rock-hopping run was to take its toll on Bernard, because he fell heavily a number of times. After 2 hours of this murderous pace, Bernard broke out of the rainforest, where he met a local lad, Eric Buchanan, who was shooting flying foxes on his farm.
Down plane, extended. Up there on ranges. See some owners. Very hot, in bad shape.
by the news that the Stinson had been found in these rugged mountains of the Macpherson Range. 2 men were alive. 5, including the 2 pilots, were dead. The discovery was made by a bushman, Bernard O'Reilly, who, following his own theory of the plane's whereabouts, fought his way through the roughest country in all Australia to succour the 2 survivors and send 100 rescuers on their way into this valley, which had held its dramatic secret for more than a week.
Local telephonist Grace Silcox played a major role in coordinating the rescue parties.
Bernard came to our place about 9 o'clock on the Sunday night and called out that he wanted to use the telephone as they had found the missing plane. And there were 2 men still alive. Then he asked me if I would arrange the rescue party from Hillview, Christmas Street and Lamington, which I did. And it was only a matter of minutes before people started to arrive with brush hooks and lanterns and tomahawks.
Birdesert Medico, Dr. Lawler and the advanced rescue party were guided by Bernard on the difficult journey back up the 3,000-foot climb to the wreck site. A trip that took 8 hours. Time was running out for the 2 men. The advance rescue party moved Binstead and Proud to a more comfortable position at the top of the ridge and remained there overnight, whilst 80 local bushmen hacked a 15-mile path to them through the dense undergrowth. Fortunately for Proud, maggots infesting his leg wound had eaten the gangrenous flesh, thus saving his life.
That the Sons of Queensland have been excellent to me. Only for those boys doing the great work they've done this last few days, well, I suppose we're finished up. I might further add that I wish to express my very deep sympathy to those who were lost in the plane.
Rex Boyden, Beverly Shepherd, William Fountain and Roland Graham. Their remains lie buried at the wreck. Jim Westray's grave lies beside Christmas Creek. John Proud's leg was saved. He became a leading Australian businessman and was later knighted. Joseph Binstead continued his business activities and died in his 80s. The 50th anniversary of the Stinson air disaster, relatives and friends hiked to the wreck for a special memorial service.
I think that 50 years ago, this was all a new wreck with the people here. That's always good to remember. So many lessons we were learned from this crash. I think in a way they didn't die in vain because aviation became rather more safe for the rest of us, the lessons that we learned from this crash. So after this, the planes began to carry radio, which made it safer. They always knew where they were and weather forecasting too. They knew what weather was ahead of them, which they didn't know at the time, which was what really got them into trouble here.
He went up to the mountain first, following his elder brothers up, who went up to select land there. The fact that Bernard virtually grew up in the rainforest surely prepared him for his epic journey in search of the Stinson years later. Bernard was not only a great bushman, he had an affinity with the mountains. He was also a gifted author, and these outstanding qualities were appreciated by the rest of the family, who were very proud of his achievements. The Stinson story is not just an O'Reilly story, it's an important part of local history. And the story belongs to quite a lot of the pioneer families, the dairy farmers that lived on the top of the Christmas Creek and the Albert River. And these men cut a track through to the Stinson and got the survivors out. They also brought the doctor up, went back up with Bernard. And their effort was rather amazing when you consider there was 10 miles of track cut in the one day. And relatives of these people certainly can be very proud of these achievements. It certainly mirrors the Australian tradition of stopping anyone in trouble.
The rescuers included men of all ages, and as this event occurred in 1937, it's to be expected that many are no longer with us. However, some of them were at that time lads as young as 16, which was the case with Roy Buchanan, who accompanied Bernard and the doctor back to the wreck. Roy was not available when we made Miracle of the Mountains 10 years ago, but he was this time, and his first-hand account is fascinating, and told now for the first time ever in this special 60th year commemorative edition.
Well, this is Mount Westrade, straight behind me. This is Christmas Creek here. Straight in front of me is Mount Buchanan. And this is where Bernard O'Reilly would have raced down here to let the world know he'd found the Stinson, when he met us about a half a mile down the road here shooting flying foxes. It was just on dusk. He called out to us not to shoot this way, because they're shooting up in the air, we told him. And we said, come across if you want to. We went over to meet him, and the first thing he said, I'm Bernard O'Reilly, I found the Stinson. He wanted to know where he was, and we told him it was Christmas Creek, Upper Christmas Creek. So we offered him a cup of tea. We boiled the billy and made him some tucker. And I went up, right up the mountain there on the horse to run the other horses in so they could saddle up and bring Bernard down. When they got to the hotel, the people in there didn't want to believe Bernard that he found the Stinson. It took a bit of convincing. They were greatly convinced that he did. So they all set sail out of the hotel and headed for home to find their brush hooks and come up to Dad's place to gather there. And then Bernard asked Dad if he'd lead the track cutting party up along the plateau, which he did. In the meantime, Bernard and Eric and a couple other mates rode on up the creek here to where we were camped. Woke us up at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was drizzling rain and we didn't feel like getting out of bed. But when we realised we had to go up to the Stinson, we soon jumped out of bed and saddled our horses and took off up with the others. We met the people from over Darlington, Steinhardt, Steveners, and they had the doctor with them. So someone boiled the billy there and had a cup of tea and we were ready to head off across up the creek there with our torches and lanterns and whatever. The doctor gave my brother Eric his bag to carry. He was responsible for that. Then we started off crossing the creek. He slipped on a rock and went under, but he managed to hold the bag above his head. And a few torches went out in the meantime. Until we eventually got up to Westrade after a lot of saturation. And we see Westrade sitting on a rock with his socks off and a cigarette between his fingers. And after the doctor had checked him out, they decided we ought to shift him back away from the creek a bit in case of more heavy rain. So they removed him, put him up the bank a little bit, and led him against the tree. And we carried on then and zigzagged across the creek until we got up about opposite where the Stinson was, and O'Reilly thought that somewhere up there now would be about where it was, so he cooeyed there and he got a reply back. So, and we headed straight up the valley then to the wreck.
We heard the party coming towards us, crashing through the bush, and Bernard and Dr. Lawler and others were there. It was a massive job to get Winstead and myself down to the ambulance waiting at Christmas Creek. I remember little of this, as I had been given substantial sedation by Dr. Lawler, whom Bernard had brought with him on his return to the crash site.
We hadn't been at the wreck too long before we got a bit inquisitive looking around, and we see these gaunt-looking two men starved there. Eyes sunk back in the head. Weren't very energetic at all. So the doctor went to work on and mixed him up some drink there with egg flip and goodness knows what else he put in it. There's a bottle of whiskey had something to do with it, I think. So after they made the stretchers and got everything lined up, some of us had to go up on top of the ridge and clear a patch there so they could put up these couple of small tents for the survivors. And after everything was going all right, we carried the men up the hill on the stretchers, which was pretty tricky because the ground was so wet and was fairly steep just there. You had to hang on the sapling so we didn't all go sliding down the hill at once. Eventually got up to the top anyway and put them in their little tents. Of course, me and my two brothers never thought about taking lunch. We didn't know how long it would take. We thought we'd be out that same day with them. So we didn't take anything. We were too anxious to get up there. So, of course, being young blokes, and we didn't like to ask anybody for a bite to eat, we just yarned around and just listened to yarns, I suppose, and try to get a bit of rest. There's an old hermit, Charlie Burgess, lived down here. He came up that day with a track cutting party. He had a big beard, of course, and some of the blokes there used to wriggle a stick in the fire now and again, make the sparks fly up and into his beard.
Charlie Burgess, the bearded hermit who was the subject of the Young Rescuers pranks, had a good knowledge of the area and was one of the architects of the famous stretcher track.
So, just after daylight, we headed off with the stretchers down the trail, taking it in turns. They kept the thing moving all the time. There's that many people there. They just had to either someone take over and others to drop out and keep going. The ones in the front of the stretcher had to hold their end up above their heads, while the ones at the rear had to lower their end down to their knees to keep them somewhat near level. We carried along like that anyway till we eventually got out down the flats where we met the ambulance then. There must have been 100 men or more at the finish there. So the next thing was, I thought was to Derry Westray then. Someone asked my brothers, Charlie and Eric, to cut the track up to Westray so they could carry the coffin up, and they might have had someone else with them. So the next week the undertaker brought the coffin up, and I had to go down with a horse and cart and load it onto the cart and bring it up about a few chains down this creek here. And then from there we had to carry it up about Must have been a couple of dozen of us. Put the coffin up, and the minister came up, and the burial service was held afterwards. My dad was asked if he would bring the headstone up for Westray and erect it. He said yes, so he brought it up with the car as far as he could, and he put it onto the pack horse. Had 2 bags of sawdust to cushion the thing. And there he came up with him, and they packed it up as far as they could in the last few chain. They had to carry it up and erect the stone.
Not many people get to visit the grave of James Westray. We filmed there in 1987, but were unable to include the material in Miracle of the Mountains. We'd like to show you that film now, and quote from Bernard O'Reilly's wonderful book, Green Mountains, in the section where Bernard describes Westray's final resting place. All red-blooded men should envy Jim Westray, who sleeps in his orchid-covered grave amidst some of the most beautiful scenery in the world. Another little spot forever England. Westray did not die in vain. 1 million young Australians will be richer for the example of his sacrifice.
As I mentioned before, it's 10 years since we produced Miracle of the Mountains, and a lot has happened during that time. Of course, we're all 10 years older, and Tim is no exception. And he portrayed Bernard in the film, and like Bernard, has a keen interest in botany. Peter Jr. also works at the guest house and is a keen naturalist as well. What's left of the wreck site now? Very little, and very soon there'll be nothing there. The plaques are there, of course, and the headstones for the 4 graves that are there. But the story, I think, will go on for a long while, the story of mateship and courage, that will live with us for a long while to come, because I think it's a wonderful story and shouldn't die.